Please be seated. Today we celebrate the feast of David Pendleton Okerator, the only Native American celebrated on the Episcopal Church calendar. His name actually memorializes key pieces of his story: a biblical first name, an Anglo middle name, and a Cheyenne last name. He adopted the first two at his baptism, the first as a link to his newfound faith, the second as a way of honoring the family who supported him and paid for his theological education, and the third, his Cheyenne name, originally pronounced something like Okahata, which means making medicine. I've heard his last name pronounced various different ways by different people, but what I've mostly heard is Okerator. So that's what I'll go with, although also he's sometimes referred to, especially when Cheyenne Christians or Episcopalians are talking about him, simply called medicine maker or making medicine. So I will refer to him in both ways in the sermon. Born around 1850, Making Medicine was a warrior and leader of the Cheyenne Indians of Oklahoma. He fought against U.S. forces in the Red River War in 1875, where he and other leaders were captured by the U.S. Army, and they were sent to a military prison in St. Augustine, Florida. There, they encountered various progressive Anglos who, as supporters of the Indian assimilation movement, taught them English and encouraged them to earn money by giving art and archery lessons to members of the surrounding community. And they shared with them their Christian faith. Okerator became a Christian and went to Syracuse, New York to study for ministry in the Episcopal Church. He describes in his letters how during that time of study, he would go out and shoot birds out of the trees with his bow and arrow. In one letter, he describes a kind of revelation that he had one day. He was suddenly struck by what he was doing, and he sat down and began to ponder and pray. And he determined that Jesus did not want him to kill again. And so he gave away his arrows, he gave away his bows, and he stopped. He renounced all violence and became what would later be called a peace chief. He was ordained to the diaconate in 1881. He returned to Watonga, Oklahoma, and there he founded schools and started missions that fed and cared for the poor. Medicine Maker continued to work among the Cheyenne until his death on August 31st, 1931. While this might feel like a story with a great movie arc, warrior to prisoner to minister to feeder of the poor, right? You can see the story. But it is in fact a very complicated and difficult story to tell. Yes, it tells of the good and joyful transformation of a life that has been touched by an encounter with Jesus. But it also exemplifies the ways colonialism destroyed indigenous cultures. It's hard to see this narrative as having an unambiguously good outcome. It displays the evils of colonialism, the complex and naive good intentions of the Indian assimilation movement, and the mysterious ways that God's providence works in the midst of human sin. One way of interpreting this story is to say that it's kind of an instance of Stockholm syndrome, right? A kind of psychological coping mechanism in which captives develop an affinity for and a sympathy for their captors. But to simply put a psychological spin on Okerator would be reductive, and it would deny him the ability to tell his own story. This is why history is complicated. In his story, he had an encounter with Jesus and the church that transformed his life in positive ways. Many of us are here because we've had an encounter with Jesus that transformed our lives in positive ways. So it's no wonder that we want to celebrate his story. But that doesn't change the fact that his story is embedded in a problematic history of colonization that included the conversion and assimilation of indigenous people, such that their own customs, language, and religions were largely lost. The two stories we read this morning from the Old and New Testaments shed light in different ways on how we can continue to tell and celebrate Oak Raiders' story. The story of Daniel rejecting the food of his captors is an interesting and maybe a rather odd passage to juxtapose with the story of making medicine, because it is in many ways the exact opposite of his story. Rather than giving in to the attempts at assimilation by Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel resisted, and we celebrate him for this. Yet we celebrate making medicine because he accepted the religion, education, and language and practices of his captors. And we call it enlightenment or getting saved. It's hard not to think that we selectively tell these stories in what can be self-serving ways. And maybe that's the recognition we need to wrestle with. The value of reading the Daniel story in conversation with that of making medicine is that it forces us to question the ways our stories and practices can make a virtue of colonization. So to tell the story truthfully, we have to acknowledge that we Christians are Nebuchadnezzar. But we also have to acknowledge that despite the problematic nature of the Indian assimilation movement, God's providence made possible a transformation in Oak Raider that would ultimately circle back to provide benefits to his Cheyenne people in Oklahoma. This is certainly true if you listen to the witness of Cheyenne Christians who today give thanks for the faith tradition they received from Oak Raider. This is the mystery of God working through and in spite of human sin. The gospel reading from Luke gives us a more positive point of comparison. The first thing the 70 apostles are told to do when they arrive in a town is to find a place to stay and to proclaim peace to this house. This is a close parallel to what Oak Raider said when he returned to the Cheyenne Arapaho people in Oklahoma. He told them this: "You all know me. You remember when I led you out to war. I went first, and what I told you was true. Now I have been away to the east, and I have learned about another captain, the Lord Jesus Christ, and he is my leader. He goes first, and all he tells me is true. I come back to my people to tell you to go with me now on this new road, a war that makes all for peace." Making medicine came back proclaiming peace. He didn't say, "I went east and found a new religion," or "I went east and took up Anglo practices," though to some extent both of those are true. Rather, what he chose to emphasize as determinative is that he learned about a new captain, Jesus, who taught him to let go of his identity as a warrior. Not his identity as Cheyenne, but his identity as a warrior, and to walk the new road of peace. What Oak Raider discovered in his journey into Christian faith was not one rival religion among others, but a religion that put an end to rivalry, a religion of peace, a religion that sought the widest possible conviviality, which meant that his own people could be caught up in the friendship of God's reign. And so when he came back to Oklahoma, he invited his people to walk with him and to take up a war that makes all for peace. Here is the witness that we can hold on to and strive to emulate. The witness of peace that requires the commitments and sacrifice of war, but in contrast to every colonizing impulse, refuses to make violence a means to bring about God's future. Thanks be to God.